Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the fourth in the current series of public lectures sponsored by the Social Science Department. Our speaker this evening gave the first 6 lectures in the first series of these public lectures on Algeria. And those lectures are coming from the printers for distribution probably at the end of this week under the title Algeria and France 1830 to 1962, published by Ball State University as third in the Ball State University manuscript series. Our speaker was born in France and has his bachelor's degree from Allegheny College in the United States. He has his master's degree from the University of Illinois and his PhD degree from the University of Illinois. Besides Ball State, our speaker has taught at the University of Illinois and at Lamar State College. And now, in our series entitled The Great Revolutions of History, we present the story of the French Revolution, and our speaker is Dr. Jacques Guittor. I'm wondering if we should make arrangements for chairs.
They must think I'm selling something. We'll have a few moments of quiet while we try to find a few places. There are 2 or 3 down here. I see 5, 6 over here if you want to try that. There's 2 more here and 2 more back there. Think we'll give them a refund if they don't find the seat? No. I got them here. I got to keep them here. A former student of mine who had watched me struggle through a whole quarter trying to get through the revolution and failing, asked me the other day how I could possibly squeeze all of that into 1 hour. And I told him that this was true. I had quite a bit of trouble, but I promise you, you'll be out of here in time to catch Peyton Place. So don't fret too much. Now, while listening to the lectures presented by my colleagues on the English and the American revolutions, I was struck by a recurrent theme which I think bears some special attention from the student of history. You may have noticed that each one of us is given a good deal of attention to the historiography of our particular revolution, bringing out the fact that interpretations of great historical events change with the times as each generation reinterprets the past in order to make it comprehensible to itself. I speak for myself only in pointing out to you that what I have to say tonight should not be taken under any circumstances as the final word on the French Revolution. For even as I am setting forth these few ideas, it is probable that some scholar somewhere is preparing for publication a new interpretation of the Revolution, which will make what I have to say quite obsolete. The facts of the Revolution, the names and the dates and the places, will not change. But the light in which these facts are cast, the emphasis given to specific events, and the relationship which the historian assigns to those events will change. And that is what gives history some of its fascination. Permit me to illustrate this point with a brief review of what we might call the history of the French Revolution. In the early 19th century, it was customary for historians to present the Revolution as the logical culmination of a long and arduous struggle between the liberty-loving French bourgeoisie and the tyrannical rule of the Bourbons. Here, Ligné and Michelet treated the pre-revolutionary period as a pyramidal figuration in which the various blocks representing abuses and struggles for liberty were gradually accumulated, culminating in one grand capstone labeled the Rights of Man or the Principles of 1789. True to their liberalism, they cooled considerably in their enthusiasm when they dealt with the Reign of Terror and the Jacobin dictatorship, events which to them represented perversions of the revolution. To this, we should add that it was customary to present the revolution as an event which was focused almost entirely in Paris, the provinces being relegated to a very secondary role. Toward the middle of the 19th century, other historians began to chip away at this revolutionary monolith, attacking both the idea that only the first 2 years of the revolution were respectable and the idea that it was essentially a Parisian phenomenon. De Tocqueville, whom you know for his Democracy in America, was the great pioneer in this effort. In his classic study of the old regime, he pointed out the importance of the provinces in the growth of the revolutionary movement and brought into play economic and social forces which heretofore had been largely ignored. But it was not until the end of the 19th century that historians took up de Tocqueville's suggestions and began seriously to break away from the spell of their predecessors. While maintaining himself within the bounds of the political school, Hollande pioneered the micro-history of the revolution, devoting countless monographs to small but very significant aspects of the revolution. In keeping with his Republican convictions, of course, Hollande undertook the rehabilitation of the First Republic and made Danton the great man of the revolution. Taking up where Thiers had begun, Sorel published his monumental study of the diplomacy of the revolution, presenting essentially for the first time the story of the Revolutionary Wars as something besides a prelude to Napoleon. Sorel thus extended the boundaries of the revolution by bringing out effectively the interplay of influences between its domestic and its foreign policy. Now, the real breakthrough came in the 20th century, with Mathiez, Lefebvre, Lavisse, Singibos, and others broadening and deepening the scope of their investigations, bringing to bear upon them new tools of research and new methods of interpretation. This led to the undoing of the revolutionary monolith and to the reconstruction of the revolution as a many-faceted, complex phenomenon. To their contributions, we should add those of Madeleine, Gaxat, Bainville, and many others, who, though conservative in point of view, provided a valuable counterpoise to the more fanciful flights of the Marxist imagination. More recently, such scholars as Michon, Voltaire, and Guérin, and Soboul have tended to dominate the field, and they have imposed pretty well their class struggle point of view. Surely the valuable contributions of non-French historians deserve mention, particularly those of Thompson, of Gottschalk, Brinton, and Palmer. Palmer has been a leader in the recent efforts to take the revolution out of France and to present it as essentially a European movement which affected the whole Western world, manifesting itself most violently, but not singularly in France. And if you were to ask me where the wave of the future lies, I would say it is in that direction. Revolutionary studies, then, have come a long way in the 150 years since the main event. Moving from monolithic simplicity to extreme complexity, from an essentially Parisian to an essentially European setting, the revolution has gradually been divested of its mythology, passing slowly into the realm of those great historical events which can be discussed with a fair degree of objectivity. To come back to my original point, however, let me add that we will never have a definitive history of the French Revolution, since history is, in the words of E.H. Carr, an imaginative reconstruction of the past. Now, the picture of the French Revolution, which is most widely accepted at the present time, is one which presents the events between 1789 and 1794 as a series of revolutionary upheavals rather than as a single revolution. One might say that there were two and possibly three revolutions during this period. The first was that of 1789, which led to the end of absolutism and the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. The second revolution was that which took place in August 1792, when the constitutional monarchy was overthrown and was replaced by a republic. The third revolution, which might be better called a coup d'etat, involved the events of May and June 1793, wherein the essentially liberal Girondist faction, which had established the republic, was overthrown by the Robespierrist faction, leading ultimately to the establishment of the Jacobin dictatorship, which lasted until July 1794. There are even those who would add a fourth revolution, that of July 1794, when the Robespierrists were overthrown and succeeded by another set of characters about along the same line. The first revolution, that of 1789, we might call the Revolution of the Lawyers, or the Middle Class Revolution, or the Constitutional Revolution. We have now a fairly clear picture of how this first revolution came about, although there is still considerable dispute as to the relative importance of these causes. Mathieu said that it was prepared slowly over a century or more. It emerged from the divorce, each day more acute, between realities and laws, between institutions and habits, between the letter and the spirit. I think Mathieu gives us here a solid clue to the basic cause of most revolutions, a lack of articulation between the needs and aspirations of the people and the institutions available for their fulfillment. 18th century France was a classic example of this articulation. Political, economic, and social institutions, grounded in the bedrock of royal authority and religious orthodoxy, and designed to govern a small agrarian nation, were imposed upon a nation of 25 million well on its way toward industrialization and secularization. A social system based on the principle of hierarchic nobility was being maintained by law in a society which daily was growing more egalitarian in outlook, at least to the extent of demanding equality before the law and the abolition of meaningless social castes. The monarchy of the Bourbons was the most absolute in Europe, but it could not cope successfully with the increasing variety of demands made upon the government in the 18th century. Moreover, it was clear that by the end of the reign of Louis XV, this would be 1774, the spirit of absolutism had long been forgotten, and only the letter, in all of its oppressive forms, remained. To make matters worse, the maintenance of the established order was, in the latter half of the 18th century, the rallying cry of thousands of grand and petty nobles, emancipated bishops and abbots, corrupt judges, grafting tax collectors, and myriad other major and minor officials whose wealth and status depended upon the perpetuation of the system. De Tocqueville struck close to the mark when he pointed out that people did not object to the existence of a nobiliar caste per se. The objection was directed rather to the fact that most of the members of the ruling order no longer performed any useful function. The efficiency-minded bourgeoisie easily acquiesced in their removal on eminently practical grounds. After all, it was their own tax money which went to support the parasites. To add insult to injury, the task of governing France was still largely left in the hands of these same parasites, giving the nation the most expensive, the most corrupt, and the most inefficient government it had ever known. As Ollart and others have pointed out, the rebellion against the existing order was not a rebellion against authority as such, but rather a rebellion against inefficient government. In short, the bourgeoisie wanted to be governed, and when the monarchy failed to govern it, it took things in its own hands. Two factors contributed considerably to the growth of dissatisfaction. Well, 3, of course, if you want to say the pheasants were starving, as it says in the freshman answer book. The pheasants. One of these factors was the presence of a rather small but extremely vocal group of critics who were generally referred to as the philosophes. The names of Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, Rousseau are familiar to us because of their contributions to the ideas behind the American Revolution. But their role in the coming of the French Revolution was most significant because they provided the discontented with the vocabulary in which to phrase their discontent and with rational arguments in justification of their attacks on the existing order. Voltaire's elegant yet withering attacks upon the church gave a sharp edge to the popular revulsion against an institution which seemed to have given up its spiritual mission. Similarly, the serious search for the natural laws of government, of social organization, of economics, carried on by Locke, Montesquieu, Hume, Gournay, Quesnay, and others, fell upon fertile ground. For every literate Frenchman reading the Encyclopedia, or the famous Encyclopédie, knew firsthand the injustices, the abuses, and the irrationality of the laws under which he lived. The philosophes themselves, I should emphasize, were not revolutionaries, not by a long shot. They favored rather a kind of benevolent paternalism, which has been called enlightened despotism, in which they assigned themselves a rather considerable role in the enlightenment of the despot. Lesser men than they carried their ideas to their logical extension, reasoning that the most effective way to secure government in the interest of the governed was to place power in the hands of the interested parties. I might point out to you that it was not Voltaire, but C.A.S., who argued, for instance, that the third estate should be everything, since it was, quote, the nation. The second factor which contributed to the general dissatisfaction in the 18th century was the fact that it was the ruling class itself which gave the example of disobedience and even of rebellion against the established order. Lefebvre has pointed this out very clearly. The revolution was begun by the aristocracy, a kind of mass suicide, a kind of strange inverted logic whereby it convinced itself that any weakening of the royal power would work to its own advantage. Conscious of the increasing precariousness of its own position in French society, the aristocracy had begun a serious effort to consolidate its power, anticipating the day when it would come under attack. But the refusal of the high nobility to give any kind of support to the crown in its efforts to deal with the crisis at the end of the century made their continued existence more distasteful and completed their discredit in the eyes of the nation. Their actions, or rather, I should say their lack of action, at the Assembly of Notables in 1788 made it clear to the nation that they were the principal stumbling block in the way of reform. It was clearly their negative revolution in 1788 which led to the positive revolution of 1789. Now, there is obviously quite some distance between disarticulation and revolution. One can hardly overstress the fact that what was wanted in 1789 was not revolution but reform. And many of the members of the bourgeoisie had the example of England's revolution of 1688 in mind. When the financial crisis of the 1780s, caused partly by France's contribution to the American Revolution, you may recall that from last week, when this financial crisis became so acute as to force the hand of the crown in the calling of the Estates Generals, the leaders of the Third Estate, this is the lower classes, saw the opportunity to extract from the crown some basic changes in the power structure of France. But they anticipated that what they wished for could be obtained simply by political pressure. The good bourgeois lawyers who represented the Third Estate at Versailles may have believed, as C.S. said, that the nation was the 45th Constitution. On June 27, 1789, Louis XVI signified his capitulation by ordering the nobles and the clergy to meet together with the Third Estate in the National Assembly. But the king was not acting in good faith, and he proceeded to bring troops to Versailles to take back by force what he had given by word of mouth. Powerless to defend itself, the National Assembly was forced then to allow the masses to come into the revolution, since only the masses, in revolt, could effectively counterbalance the might of the crown. The price which the bourgeoisie paid, reluctantly, was a temporary loss of control over the revolution. But it should be pointed out that the alternative to bringing the masses into the revolution was capitulation to the crown. Everyone knows the story of the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789. Some have heard of the Wave of Terror, which is known as the Great Fear, which followed. Some have heard of the March of the Women on Versailles in October, which resulted in the transfer of the king and of the National Assembly to Paris. All of these events are episodes in the struggle between the monarchy, seeking to regain its power, and the masses, reluctantly pushed on by the bourgeoisie, seeking to consolidate the position of the National Assembly. The National Assembly was caught in its own trap and could do little except legalize the actions of the masses. The abolition of feudalism on August 4th, 1789, was the legal translation of a fait accompli, and so was the adoption of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Feudalism had been abolished, and equality before the law had already been established by the force of the national upheaval. As Mathieu suggested, the bourgeoisie was astounded, and I might add, horrified, at the suddenness and the violence of the outbreak of popular sentiment. What the bourgeoisie wanted was a nice revolution. What it had gotten was a little more than it had asked for. Eventually, popular enthusiasm subsided, and the National Assembly regained control of the situation. By the end of the year 1789, it had once more taken things in hand and proceeded to consolidate the newly acquired position of the bourgeoisie as the ruling class in France. During the next 2 years, it took up the Herculean task of demolishing the old regime and of giving France new institutions in keeping with the prevailing concept of good government. Into these new institutions, the National Assembly introduced the two great principles of election and decentralization. The old provinces were broken up, and France was divided into some 83 departments, that is, administrative divisions, each endowed with an elected assembly. And finally, a new constitution was drawn up, which gave France a constitutional monarchy and enshrined the bourgeoisie's political power in its electoral laws. A serious effort to reform the finances of the state was undertaken, concentrating on the expropriation of church lands, the abolition of innumerable restrictions on trade and industry, and the rationalization of the tax system. At the same time, the National Assembly shrewdly created a large class of hardcore supporters of the revolution by the sale of confiscated church land to the land-hungry peasants. Altogether, and all things considered, the National Assembly gave an excellent account of itself, and its accomplishments in 1790 and 1791 rank it as one of the most efficient governments France has ever had. Of course, there's some people who argue you don't have to go very far for that. The first revolution, the Constitutional Revolution, came close to achieving its goals and did this with a minimum of stress and of violence. The fundamental transformation of French society was well underway when the National Assembly ushered in its successor, the Legislative Assembly. Now, great things were expected of the Legislative Assembly when it assumed control over the fate of France. It was true that this new legislature was made up of men new to the career of politics, since the National Assembly had voted to make its own members ineligible to succeed themselves. But it was also true that these new men were not very different in attitudes from their predecessors. They, too, represented the bourgeoisie almost to the exclusion of all other classes. Landowners, industrialists, and tradesmen had a strong voice in this body, and it was fully expected that it would simply carry on with the reforms which the National Assembly had begun. Certainly, no one seriously expected that it would carry the revolution any further than it had already gone. Born in this climate of conservative expectation, the Legislative Assembly found itself confronted with the great problem which ultimately caused its downfall. Now, up to 1791, the European powers had not seriously attempted to interfere in the affairs of France. After all, the crowned heads of Europe had no particular objection to seeing cousin Louis XVI in trouble, for as long as France was embroiled in her own internal problems, she was not making war on Europe. The National Assembly had, in its foreign policy, skillfully exploited this indifference and had taken good advantage of the difficulties which kept the European powers from reaching agreement in concerted action against France. The Legislative Assembly was not so fortunate. As of late 1791, the rulers of Europe began to show greater concern over the impact of the revolution outside of France. They were deeply troubled by the unrest among their own subjects. They could readily see that the focus of agitation was in Paris, and that they were becoming alarmed at the truculence of the oratory issuing from the Legislative Assembly. Inevitably, the French Revolution was acquiring missionary overtones, and there were those in and out of the government who were convinced that the French nation was chosen by the Supreme Creator as the torchbearer of liberty and the chosen agent for the overthrow of tyranny. That a generally aggressive French foreign policy fitted in very well with this tradition, and that Louis XVI and his entourage saw in the war an opportunity to restore their own power did not help matters very much. Moreover, those who were concerned over the weakening of the revolutionary spirit throughout France saw in a missionary war an opportunity to revive it. And then there were those ambitious men in the Legislative Assembly who stood ready to exploit the war for their own purposes as an instrument for the advancement of their own power. Altogether, everything conspired to bring France into conflict with Europe. And as of 1792, it was only a matter of time until the conflagration should begin. It was revolutionary France which declared war on Austria on April 20th, 1792. It was felt appropriate that liberty should declare war on tyranny, and there were many who believed that the slaves of monarchy would fall thunderstruck before the banners of freedom. Unfortunately, as Robespierre had so aptly foreseen, the armed missionaries of freedom found the troops of Austria and Prussia just as tough as ever. The armies of the revolution, beset by poor organization, by treasonous officers, and by an uncertain government in Paris, soon began to fall back, abandoning fortress after fortress and leaving the road to Paris wide open. June and July 1792 were dark months in the history of the Revolution. The Legislative Assembly, dominated by the friends of Brissot, did not seem able or willing to bring itself to take the stern measures necessary to the reorganization of the armies and the organization of the French nation on a war footing. Their own inflamed oratory had betrayed them, and they were surprised to find that the sacred words of liberty, equality, and fraternity seemed to be no match for Austrian battalions. Moreover, it was an open secret that France was being betrayed daily by a monarch who wished devoutly for the defeat of his own country. Under these circumstances, it is not surprising that a steadily increasing number of leaders in Paris and in the provinces should begin to think seriously about throwing the traitors out of the government and taking such measures as might be necessary to ensure the protection of France and the preservation of the revolution. Hollande has pointed out very clearly that the war drastically altered the balance of forces in France and ultimately forced the course of the revolution in a direction which was not to the liking of the conservative bourgeoisie who had started it and who had controlled it up to 1792. The problem was that in starting the war, the Legislative Assembly, it placed itself in the position of having to call upon the masses for support, be it for the ranks of the armies or in the program of heavy taxation made mandatory to further the war effort. But the masses had, so to speak, learned their lesson in 1789. They're trying to tell me something? In 1789, the masses felt that they had been used by the bourgeoisie to defeat the crown, and then they had found themselves relegated to an inferior status by an electoral law which disfranchised most of them. Now, in 1792, they were quite willing to give their money and their blood for the salvation of the nation, but they were determined to extract a number of concessions in payment for these sacrifices. When the Legislative Assembly proved unwilling to grant them these concessions, they simply moved against it, overthrowing the constitutional monarchy and replacing it with a new government which was, so they believed, more willing to listen to their complaints. The troubles which arose between the masses and the Legislative Assembly set the pattern for the subsequent history of the Revolution. There was, from 1792 to 1800, a kind of dialectical relationship between government and masses, as the government found it necessary to make more and more concessions to the masses in order to keep up the war effort, while at the same time keeping the masses under control in an effort to prevent the further extension of the revolution. The problem was never successfully resolved until Napoleon stepped in 1800, promising to give everyone everything. Yet there are those who would argue that, with considerable truth, I think, that even Napoleon never succeeded in solving this problem, for his own downfall was caused in part by the fact that the masses grew tired of giving him their sons as cannon fodder. Coming back to the troubles of the Legislative Assembly in 1792, we find in June and July a growing movement of discontent in Paris and in the provinces, which was directed primarily at the government's inability to pursue the war with any success. Led by Robespierre, Danton, and the Paris Commune, the people of Paris demonstrated peacefully on June 20th, 1789, with the implicit suggestion being made that they stood ready to take things in their own hands should the Legislative Assembly fail to act. The legislators did not take the cue, and instead they stood idly by while Lafayette threatened to purge the political club. Subsequently, Lafayette went over to the Austrians, thereby considerably darkening the climate of opinion in Paris. You may know that the hero of two worlds, that is Lafayette, hero of the American and the French Revolution, is called by some historians the zero of two worlds. This is one of the reasons why. Thousands of volunteers pouring in from the provinces were skillfully organized and propagandized by Robespierre to serve as the backbone of a new insurrection. The masses of Paris were kept at a fever pitch of agitation and daily presented virulent petitions to the Legislative Assembly against the Crown, the court, the generals, and every other suspected agent of the counter-revolution. Finally, on August 10th, 1792, the insurrection broke out, taking the form of an assault upon the Tuileries, that is the royal residence, which resulted in the defeat of the monarchy and the triumph of the Paris Commune. This second revolution, the uprising of August 10th, was a revolution in the full sense of the word, in that the existing regime was overthrown by force, and in that the masses reasserted their power and once more entered the revolutionary arena as a major force to be reckoned with. From this point on, the government would be powerless to act without their general consent. The Legislative Assembly was forced to recognize this fact and eventually divested itself of its own power. But before doing this, it undertook a protracted struggle with the Paris Commune for control of the revolution. It must therefore bear a good deal of responsibility for the massacres which took place in early September 1792, for it was its own unwillingness to punish those who had fired upon the people which gave substance to the rumor that a plot was afoot to turn the prisoners loose upon the people of Paris. As Messier put it succinctly, the September massacres, in which some 4,500 people were killed, were an indelible blot upon the revolution, used by reactionaries during the 19th century as a fine example of the evils which befall a nation which falls prey to democracy. One cannot, of course, excuse the massacres. There's no way of doing that. But one can at least understand them, for the climate of opinion under which they took place was indeed most dark. In the long run, the Legislative Assembly won its power struggle with the Paris Commune and was able to turn over to its successor, the Convention, a fairly intact government. Still, the Legislative Assembly left behind it a long record of ineptitude and failure, not the least of which was the precarious military situation which prevailed as of September 1792. One might have expected that the Convention, which met in September of 1792, would concentrate its attention on the critical situation at hand. Instead, the Girondist faction which controlled it, led by Brissot, Vergniaud, Guadet, and some others, immediately began a concerted campaign of abuse designed to discredit Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, the three great popular heroes of the time. The Girondist attack on the so-called triumvirate was partly personal, partly based on some basic differences in political philosophy. The personality quarrel revolved around the fact that the Girondists were jealous of the popularity of the three heroes of the Revolution. They had never forgiven Robespierre for opposing them on the question of the war. Danton they regarded as the chief architect of August 10th and of the September massacres. And as for Marat, their dislike for him was in a way congenital. The well-mannered, cultured gentlemen of the Girondist faction held Marat in contempt for his lowly origin, and even more so for his gutter journalism. It was Marat who accused the Queen of all kinds of unnatural acts. And this was not to the liking of the Girondists. The political differences between the two groups were, of course, in the long run, much more important. The Girondists represented the upper classes, or rather the upper and middle bourgeoisie. Essentially, they were liberal in political and economic philosophy, and they were very suspicious of the masses. Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, on the other hand, tended to pitch their appeal to the lower bourgeoisie and the upper levels of the working classes, and they desired each in his own way to extend the revolution much farther than it had gone. I should point out that to lump these three together, as the Girondists did, was a very bad mistake and very much of an oversimplification. But for the moment, the Girondist attack on Marat and Robespierre and Danton had the effect of uniting the people against them, that is, against the Girondists, and of arousing popular anger. About all that the Girondists succeeded in doing was to bring discredit on themselves, for it was an easy matter for their opponents to point out that they were putting personal quarrels and political ambition above the interests of the nation. Further discredit fell upon the Girondists in December of 1792, when many of them voted against the death penalty for Louis XVI. Certainly there is little evidence that they were trying to save the king so as to make a deal with the Austrians. On the other hand, their efforts on behalf of Louis XVI were interpreted by the masses as a lack of commitment to the revolution. Ultimately, the greatest failing of the Girondists was their inability to bring themselves to take the extraordinary measures which an extraordinary situation required. The war was still going very badly in early 1793. The Vendée was in revolt, which is western France. Instances of treason were daily occurrences, and the problem of supplying food for the large cities still had not been solved. Under great pressure, the Girondists did bring themselves to the creation of a Committee of Public Safety and a Committee of General Security, but they also managed to restrict the authority of these institutions so closely as to make them ineffectual. In the long run, the Girondists were ideologically and constitutionally unable to bring themselves to pay the price for popular support. As faithful representatives of the middle class, they could not permit the government to launch the general redistribution of property and they could not bring themselves to launch the general redistribution of property and the equalization of wealth, which alone would have satisfied the masses and rallied them to the cause. In May 1793, the Girondist government found itself confronted by a campaign of agitation from all sides. By the end of the month, the Paris Commune, pushed on by Robespierre, was demanding a purification of the convention, that is to say, the forcible removal of the Girondists and the establishment of a strong revolutionary government. On June 2nd, the forces of the Commune surrounded the hall of the convention and, by the simple weight of their numbers, forced the convention to vote the arrest of the Girondists. No blood was shed in this overthrow of the government, and for that reason it might be better described as a coup d'etat rather than as a revolution. Yet this latest upheaval was in many ways revolutionary in the sense that the masses, the Fourth Estate so well described by Girondists, finally obtained considerable influence over the course of the revolution. Robespierre gained control over the government only at the cost of extensive concessions to the masses, among them the confiscation and the redistribution of property of counter-revolutionaries in the Ventose decree. The overthrow of the Girondists in June 1793 was followed by what was undoubtedly the darkest period of the whole revolution. The government in Paris controlled effectively something around 40% of the nation, not more. The Vendée was on fire. The Girondists had raised the standard of a federalist revolt in southern France. It was interesting, they were arguing for states' rights. And the war was going so badly that royalists were openly predicting the imminent fall of the revolution. At the Jacobin Club, Robespierre held forth daily on the perils besetting liberty. He did his usual confession of sin, and he indicated his desire to die rather than to live to see the fall of the revolution. But Robespierre did not die, and the revolution did not collapse. Instead, the Girondist revolt set off a reaction which resulted in a renewal of popular enthusiasm for the convention, and it found itself in a position stronger than it had ever been. The committees of public safety and of general security, that is, the great committees as they're called, were given new powers and a new membership, including Robespierre. The Revolutionary Tribunal made itself formidable to the enemies of the revolution, and the judicious injection of new officers into the army and the very judicious use of the guillotine in appropriate places turned the tide of war. Even Hollande was forced to forget it for a moment his blind hatred of Robespierre and to admit that the Committee of Public Safety under Robespierre's leadership had saved France in her darkest hour. And I guarantee you that for Hollande this was quite an admission. From its low point in July 1793, the revolution reached its high tide in December of 1793, 6 months later. Belgium and Savoy were now French territory, and to them were spread the benefits of the revolution. The rebellion in the Vendée was contained, partly by putting some of the rebellious people on barges and knocking the bottom of the barges and sending them down to the bottom of the river. This was one way of putting down a rebellion. The authority of the convention as of December 1793 was unchallenged. Many looked forward to a relaxation of the reign of terror and to the day when good patriots might enjoy the fruit of their hard work. But this was not to be, for Robespierre and Saint-Just, the moving spirits in the Committee of Public Safety, had decreed that the revolution was not yet over, and that the terror should continue until all of the enemies of the revolution had been eliminated. Instead of calling for moderation, Robespierre called for more heads. Instead of asking for an easing of tension, Saint-Just called for greater straining of the revolutionary springs. In a series of great speeches before the convention, Robespierre, ably seconded by Saint-Just, outlined the ultimate purpose of his program. The terror, he said, was the despotism of liberty against tyranny. And he argued that virtue has always been in the minority, and that it would continue to be so long as there were those selfish enough to exploit the revolution for their own purposes. Only by making itself terrible to its enemies could liberty triumph. True lovers of freedom could not rest until the nation had purified itself. While the enemies of liberty to whom Robespierre addressed himself were the rich who were corrupted by too much wealth, the ambitious who sought political power, the immoral who corrupted the soul of the people, the shirkers who avoided their duty, and the atheists who poisoned the national soul. By one last stupendous effort, said Robespierre, the government must eliminate these enemies so that the reign of virtue should be ushered in. We have reached the most controversial period of the revolution, and what is for me the most interesting, since it was the most truly revolutionary, also since I spent quite some time with it. Historians are divided in their opinions into two broad factions. Those who believe that Robespierre and his friends merely sought power by any means, fair or foul, and those who were convinced that Robespierre and his cohort were genuinely devoted to the cause of a regeneration of French society. I think that the truth inclines in the direction of the latter, that is, that Robespierre did seek a regeneration of French society, although I'm not willing to go as far as Mathieu would go in that direction. Robespierre was, in the full sense of the word, a good 18th century visionary moralist who saw himself as the agent appointed by the Supreme Being to redesign French society. He was the leader of a solid faction called the Jacobins, a faction which he led into a holy crusade of social regeneration. I think Crane Britton has made this point quite well. Robespierre's ideas, it should be pointed out, were not systematically developed in the sense of systems such as that of Karl Marx. But toward the end of his career, let's say as of April 1794, he was moving gradually towards the completion of an ideological framework which might ultimately have served as the basis of a total revolution along the lines with which we are accustomed to deal. It does not really matter much that his ideas were rather quaint, and that the people to whom his reign of virtue was addressed existed primarily in his own overactive imagination. What does matter is that he was the first of a long line of revolutionary leaders who developed the modern concept of a revolution based on an ideology which becomes the point of reference for all revolutionary acts, and which relies on a small body of dedicated followers to put that idea into practice. Robespierre was also the first to systematically develop an ideological justification for the use of terror as an instrument of government and of social regeneration. He was the first to extend the concept of crime to include ideological deviation. Ultimately, he developed a cult of the Supreme Being. This was a new religion, which he came to see as the cornerstone of his revolutionary edifice. In the years of close association with the revolution, he had come to the conclusion that the masses were not sufficiently conscious of their own position, not sufficiently virtuous in the sense of being dedicated to liberty, equality, and fraternity, to fit readily into the new society. He thus came to believe that before the masses could be integrated and admitted into the Republic of Virtue, they must undergo a moral re-education which would wean them away from their, quote, ancient prejudices, unquote, their traditional moral and religious ways of thinking and would convert them to the new life. 100 years before Lenin and Mao Zedong, Robespierre discovered that true revolutions are not made by the masses per se, for the masses are essentially amorphous and aimless. Only when the masses are properly led and indoctrinated do they become the efficient agent of revolution. Under Robespierre's iron hand, the Jacobins became the enlightened vanguard which spread the good word, formed the cadre of the new society, and watched carefully over the orthodoxy of the bureaucrats and the generals, as well as of the average citizen. I do not wish to leave you with the impression that Robespierre was a great man, or even a great revolutionary. After all, as Sobol has pointed out, he was merely a moralizing petit bourgeois gone mad, which is a pretty good description. I do want to underscore, however, the fact that his position in the revolution and in the history of revolutions in general is unique, and that as a pioneer in the dubious art of redesigning societies, he left a considerable legacy to the world. From Bakunin to Ben Bella, modern revolutionaries have acknowledged their debt to him, and Marx paid him the supreme compliment of studying his career very closely, although I might add mostly for the mistakes he's made. Taken altogether, Robespierre's final conception of the revolution anticipated on many points the modern theory of revolution expounded by Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong, and many others. Two things should be said to qualify the statement, underscoring the fact that we should not leap to the conclusion put forth by Mathieu that Robespierre was really the father of Marxism. He was not. One point which must be made is that Robespierre's ideas remained largely at the embryonic stage, and that very few of them were even halfway developed. One might say simply that he sketched only the broad outlines of ideas which were subsequently systematized by others. The other point is that Robespierre worked in a sense backward, and that is to say that he proceeded from particular facts of the revolution toward general principles, and that his basic revolutionary doctrine was stated at the end rather than the beginning of his career. This is certainly what the cryptic jottings in his famous notebook indicate. It accounts also to some extent for the lack of consistency in his views, since he tended to work from effect to cause rather than from cause to effect. In broad terms, one may conclude that Robespierre anticipated Marx's ideas on such things as the problem of class consciousness, the necessity of a revolutionary elite, and the role of revolutionary government in completing the revolution after the initial outbreak. He also vaguely anticipated Lenin's theory of the withering away of the state. I can never say that right. When he indicated in several of his speeches that there would come a time when the virtue of the citizens would make coercive government unnecessary, and the state would thus disintegrate from lack of need for its functions. The principal difference between Robespierre and his Marxian successors is to be found in the nature of the ultimate perfect society. Robespierre's ideal citizen was not the proletarian of Marx, but the individualistic, moralistic petit bourgeois who collected 300 pounds revenue per year. This is quite a difference, I might add. Well, the ground upon which the seeds of Robespierre's revolution fell proved increasingly less fertile, almost in inverse proportion to the refinement of his ideas. As his concept of virtue became, so to speak, razor sharp, the number of corrupt men who felt threatened with the guillotine increased by the thousands. Ultimately, no one was safe from Robespierre's all-seeing gaze, the famous sea-green eye described by Carlyle. Terror, in the full sense of the word, reigned, for the definition of crime had become so broad that there were few who could not be brought before the revolutionary tribunal to pay for sins either of commission, or omission. Fewer and fewer proved willing to move with Robespierre into the rarefied atmosphere of his republic, and even the majority in the convention and in the streets deserted him, unable to understand how it had come to pass that men such as Danton and Desmoulins, solid pillars of the revolution from its inception, could be sent to the guillotine for ideological deviation. As Mathias put it so well, in the spring of 1794, the revolution became frozen, incomprehensible to the masses, a threat to the average citizen who did not really mind a bit of corruption, since after all, corruption is the spice of life. The terrible blade on the square of the nation, the guillotine, daily took a greater toll of heads, and the Revolutionary Tribunal was sentencing victims in what they call batches of 50 people or more. The right of defense was even done away with, as Robespierre believed that the enlightened conscience of 12 good citizens was sufficient to determine on the guilt or innocence of the accused. People laughed openly, yet hollowly, when Robespierre led the nation in the establishment of the cult of the Supreme Being, an odd assortment of Greek and Christian mythology, liberally sprinkled with homely virtues. Members of the convention whispered loudly behind Robespierre's back about his papacy and began to look for the flaw in the armor. They did not have far to look, for Robespierre was a proud man, and he withdrew in a huff when he was accused of seeking premature canonization. His withdrawal merely gave his enemies a free hand in plotting his downfall. When he returned to the convention in late July 1794, the machinery designed to overthrow him was set in motion. When he tried to speak, he was shouted down, and his arrest was decreed, along with that of several of his closest associates. On 9th Thermidor, that is to say July 27th, 1794, exactly 1 year after he joined the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre became the most famous victim of the guillotine, the victim being the man who had made it into an instrument of government. The fall of Robespierre, on this perhaps the most famous date of the revolution, 9th Thermidor, the fall of Robespierre was not, strictly speaking, the end of the revolution, for the men who had overthrown him were not moderates in any sense of the word. I think here we must follow Mathias and Lefebvre, who point out that Thermidor was merely a power struggle, a new coup d'etat, in which the anti-Robespierrists simply seized control of the terror, intending to use it for their own purposes. But in the popular imagination, the death of Robespierre was associated and interpreted with the end of the reign of terror, and as a signal for the relaxation of tension. Mathias put it very well when he said that the people of France were tired of being heroic, and that they longed for nothing as dearly as for a chance to lay down the burdens of the revolution. Try as they might, the Thermidorians had to give in to this popular pressure, and within a year they had demolished the entire structure of the revolutionary government. By an odd twist of fate, they themselves became victims of the guillotine in the wave of reaction which followed, which we call the Thermidorian reaction. The next few years were years of consolidation for the power of the bourgeoisie, that same bourgeoisie which had begun the revolution in 1789, had temporarily lost control of it in 1793, and was now coming back with a vengeance. Ultimately, Napoleon was to come along, and with his genius for organization and administration, was able to arbitrate the revolutionary argument and to translate the revolution into lasting institutions. To place the French Revolution in its proper historical perspective is not easy. In terms of the history of France, it led to a complete remodeling of French society, establishing firmly the rule of the middle class for a century to come. In that sense, it was a successful revolution, if for no other reason than that it struck a responsive chord in the heart of the French people with sufficient force to make them willingly expend their blood and treasure for its preservation. No better example of this can be found than in the magnificent response of the people to the call for volunteers for the defense of the nation in 1792 and 1793. Some may argue, of course, that this was patriotism rather than love for the revolution. But I would answer that the patriotism of the French in 1792 was very closely tied with the revolution. For the first time in their history, the common people had been offered a stake in the life of the nation, and they responded with their blood when the stake was threatened. Eventually, these same patriots became the missionaries of revolution, spreading its ideas to Europe and setting off a series of shock waves which were felt the world over. In my estimation, the greatest impact of the revolution was in the important precedent which it set, which was simply that it proved that revolution is an effective and efficient means of accomplishing desired ends. You may wish to argue, of course, that the American Revolution set that precedent. But I would remind you that in the thinking of 19th century Europe, America was a very remote land in which such things as revolution might very well happen. The great impact of the French Revolution came from the fact that it was successfully carried out against the most powerful, the most deeply entrenched, and the most glorious monarchy in Europe. The fall of the Bastille and the execution of Louis XVI captured Europe's imagination much more fully than Lexington and Concord. With the Revolution, a way of life came to an end, and a new wave came to the fore based on the unleashed might of the people. We shall see another crest of this same wave next week in Dr. Bast's lecture on the Russian Revolution. Thank you very much.